How have you been?
I've been good. We are beginning I work
We
at a
can
wedding.
go in whatever direction we want to, as it were, down the aisle of a dialogue and sharpen the edges of whatever was occurring to us as they occurred to us in the past weeks since we have uh, discussed things. One thing I was looking at today while I was standing in a retail aisle was behind the table. There was an array of boxes of Legos. And one of them had the promise of a replica, that with these pieces, you could put together an NES, a Nintendo Entertainment System. But not only that, you could put together with these pieces a replica of a television set. And not only that, you could put together with these pieces a replica. Consider the offering. Legos of an entertainment system. What is being satisfied from a Marxian perspective? Where is the surplus value? What's being extracted as value? Is it that I can make this thing which I cannot play with? And there's some humor also in it, dropped in there, because you're not only putting together an NES, but you're putting together a television, neither of which will turn on, have outlets. So once you're done, you've only begun to hunger and thirst for a Nintendo Entertainment System. You haven't satisfied or completed anything except the building up of a desire, perhaps. But that is the very desire which is being preyed upon or pressed down upon or activated when you say, I would like to make a replica of this experience I could have had I the entertainment system, the controller, and the television. What are we doing? What is this? Phenomenologically, sociologically, whatever way you want to approach it, but what is this? Let alone what are Legos? These things which anybody could make, but somehow have an intellectual value that is particular to someone, that if you were doing it, they might sue you because you're doing it in their way. But again, what is Lego but a building up of something which doesn't, once you put all the parts together, doesn't become the thing. So already it's dealing internally with a contradiction that is quite open about. Legos. You could put together a Star Wars craft. Now you can put together an NES. Maybe someday they'll have a hand. So it's infinitely malleable and adaptable and hoppable, but it's peculiar to a company with intellectual rights behind it. So that leads me to this binary I really want to talk about, which is that between plot and story. And I think it is less dangerous to live a plotted life than a storied life. In fact, if you take story as the same word as myth, it might be false advertisement to think I could live in a story. What would you say? Wherever you want to take it.
That's really interesting. I was thinking as you were speaking to start, why do we want to represent things? Like, why, when we see a forest, do we go, oh, I want to paint it? Isn't it right there? Can't you look at it? There's a tradition as well of, don't make any graven images, right? There's a danger in making images. There's also something with imagery that seems to be honoring. If it's important, you would take a picture of it. Why do people take pictures of birthday parties? Because it's a way of honoring it. So there's a lot of things that are curious about representation or making models. There are some ways of doing it that seem to be an honoring of it. There are some ways that seem to be hubris, pride. Oh, I can make things just as good as the world, or I can make a golden calf and then worship it. And then there's also forms of creation where I will make an NES with Legos so that I can make a red NES, something that didn't exist. It has similarities, but it's slightly different. It's also interesting to think of this difference between plot and story, because it's almost like a plot is safer, maybe, where a story is more open-ended, or it's more suggestive of something beyond itself. So for example, there's building Legos with the directions. And then when you're done building the Legos, you can look at the image on the box and say, yes, I did it correctly. But then there's also the form of building Legos that is, I'm going to just build a city out of my imagination. And there's no way to confirm when you've done it right or when you've done it wrong or what direction you should go in. And yet there is a kind of felt sense as you're going along the way. And there seems to be room for both, but there also seems to be a danger. What does seem to be the danger of like the graven image, it's some sort of moralization of it, some sort of replacement of the alive with the stagnant, some kind of, oh, I have control over the becoming into being in a kind of negative way, in a bad way. And I wonder if actually a lot of the modern world is like, a lot of the modern world is almost an effort to have human life be plotted but not storied. And that could be associated with something mechanical. I think of the difference. I'm good friends and speak often with Andrew Luber and Alex, and they were on the Meaning Code, and they would talk about story and theme and all these different things. And so for them, we'll talk all the time about how a story has a theme where a plot is a sequence without a theme. And a thematic element is kind of what's being realized and brought. There's something that's coming out in the story. When the characters are going to the house in the forest, they're not just going to the house in the forest. It's also some sort of going into the depths of the inferno or the depths of the interior life. There's some other thing that is occurring in the act of going there. It's kind of like, makes me think a bit of where Jack Mills described the New Testament as an arm with tattoos. And the tattoos were the Old Testament. And what he meant by that is whenever the arm moves, it's bringing with it all the imagery of the Old Testament as well. So the arm, you know, the New Testament is like an arm covered in tattoos of the Old Testament. And it can't move without bringing all those images and stories of what came before it. And a story seems to do something similar. It seems to kind of bring with it a thematic element, a meaning, as it moves, as it's being carried out, that is in addition to the sequence of events that one might call the plot or something like that. Like an arm moving with tattoos, whereas a plot may be missing the tattoos. Maybe it's just an arm, but it's not bringing with it a story, or it's not bringing with it a theme or meaning beyond itself. And it's kind of interesting as well, like when we build Legos without directions, we bring with us in the act of building those Legos all the years of following the directions, just to leave them behind. Like we learn how to do the Legos so that we can do the Legos without the directions. So you're kind of carrying that with you. Likewise, you learn how to do a plot so one day you can do a story that's also bringing with a theme and a meaning beyond itself. So the first thing that kind of just comes to mind is perhaps story is Legos without directions. That is only possible because of years of training with directions. Whereas a plot is Legos with direction. You can say, oh, I had the rising action, the climax, and I followed the image, I followed the directions. This is a plot, but it may not have that something more to it. Because some of the most fun Lego things to encounter are the Legos where you go, oh, how did they come up with that? Oh, that's an interesting take on a castle. Oh, I haven't seen that before. That kind of strikes you. That also points to the history of all the Legos that may have come before. So it's interesting to me to think of, is there something about story that is Legos without plot? So story is Legos without directions, possible because of directions, whereas plot is Legos with directions. If there's something there, I'd be curious if anything comes up for you on that.
What comes to my mind is two analogous strains of philosophy would take, and it would fork at one. Well, the history of philosophy is the discovering of aporia, of impasses, of knots, of ways that we entangle ourselves in daily life, in speech, with one another, the ways in which things lag epistemologically or are frozen ontologically for us. And so the history of philosophy is the underwriting of the discoveries made about these impasses. And so what would suffice for a history of philosophy in that regard is a list. List the problems. That's what we want. The more succinct and the longer, the better. And the other side of the history might be fine, but the point of philosophy, the way you know that you're putting the pieces together correctly, is you solve these problems. So a satisfying list for the person on the other side would be, and this might be a Wittgenstein, would be one half of the story is to discover the problems. The other half is to provide unique, satisfying solutions to each of them. And the magnificent thing, he might say, about this second road is that once you have discovered the solution, it eats the minnow of the problem. And the problem is gone.
Right.
It's resumed and brought up inalterably higher now. It can't be brought back down to a naivete. How? What are the mechanisms of distributing that assurance to everybody? I don't know. But he would then say that the history of philosophy therefore has a shelf life. There is a terminal number to this list that once you provide all the unique solutions, you're done. And then the structure made with the Legos, made with the problems, made with the discoveries, made with the solutions is done. And I wonder, is Wittgenstein telling a story? And say the Aristotelians who want to make philosophy about discovering problems, they're mired in plot. They're always wanting to talk about what something means. As Graham Harman would say, they're trying to give a paraphrase to whatever the phenomenon is. Whereas Wittgenstein's trying to explain away, give a just so account, trying to subsume all the details in a nice stereotype that includes everybody, that has all the thematic goodies and bells and whistles we like and can relate to. They both partake of time and a process. So, and I'd like to hear your thought on this because I know you studied Hegel. Is this where Hegel comes in and starts to say, well, both of you are talking about what I have been talking about, namely the higher mode of cognition, whereby the process of philosophy finds its right step after the left step. And here I am to tell you.
It's a great question that you present there. And I like thinking Wittgenstein in that way. I like it as well because he was so fascinating on Franzen, the golden bar, and thinking about how it's very difficult for us to approach story precisely because we don't let the horizon of the story come with the story. We, in a kind of Gadamer sense, we bring our own horizon to past stories. So we can't imagine, we really can't understand these myths with it. And he's trying to defend a kind of horizon that we let the story disclose to us, or like Luber would say, the theme, or different things. And it's very interesting to suggest that philosophy in a way is trying to arrive, like without this point where you kick the ladder away, without this point where there's something that cannot be said, then nothing was said. Like there has to be, like speaking has to reach a point where nothing is left to be said, if anything was said. Like words that never reach a point where they fall silent, it's as if they were never uttered. They're just a clanging of bells or something, clanging of pots. And so a philosophy that doesn't reach some sort of end of philosophy ends up not having a point. You know, the word end is always funny, right? It doesn't have a conclusion nor a point, right? But what's very interesting is how can philosophy stay alive and yet also have a point? That means it has to end without ending. It has to like point and kind of clobber on its end and circle back around and come back in different things. And that's interesting to think because then it means philosophy is always searching for where it is terminated so that it isn't terminated, so that it continues circling and circling. And for me, I do think what we see in Hegel, which is very interesting, is an idea that all thought is always passing over into something it is not, into its otherness. And as a result, thought never stops because it's always passing over. But in that endless passing over, that actually in a way could suggest that philosophy is over, because you're never going to find a thought that isn't dialectical. So what's the point? You never reach an end point. But what's funny is it's actually precisely in the realization that thought is always passing over into otherness that then you can speculate why. In the same way that if philosophy or words only say something if they eventually reach a place where they fall silent, then we can ask the question, why? Why is it that words have to reach a point where they fail in order to feel like they were spoken at all? Why is it that it almost seems like we have to get to the place where we can build Legos without directions to feel like we ever mastered using them with directions? Like there really is a sense where if you can never get to the place where you can imagine, or like create representations that are not merely reducible to what you represent, there's a way in which you never even figured out how to do representation. And so what Hegel would kind of invite us to think, and then I'll give it back to you, is why is thought a thing that is always moving into otherness? When you think an apple, you're then thinking red, you're then thinking stem, you're then thinking fruit. Like the apple is always passing over into another category to understand itself, which then it's like, well, what's the point at all? If every thought passes to the next, what's the point of thinking a thought? And Hegel would say, well, ask the question, what does it mean that thought is always passing over into the next? And then that opens a new horizon, but now we're in the horizon of what for him is speculative knowing. And what is very interesting as well with Wittgenstein is how interested he was, say, in Master Eckhart or the mystical, I think it's the Race Reflections on Wittgenstein book. It was a friend of his that talked how interested Wittgenstein was with mystical poetry toward the end of his life. So what you see, what's so interesting about Wittgenstein is that the end of philosophy is not the end of thought. I think that's what we actually often read into Wittgenstein. Like the end of thinking in a way is the beginning of contemplation, the Catholic tradition of contemplatio, right? So it's almost, what's interesting, it's important that we don't see in Wittgenstein an individual who kicks the ladder away and is done thinking. He kind of tried that, right? He went off and was a school teacher and he did all these different things, but I think he did some architectural work and all of that, but then he comes back. And it suggests that thinking and philosophy almost have to reach a point where they negate sublate into contemplatio in order to validate they happened at all. Like thought that does not move into contemplation, it's almost like it's not even thought. And I think if we take that seriously, then we would think in a manner that's not merely looking for the answer, but thinking that would move us into a terrain, a space in which that sort of contemplation, that contemplation prayer, if you will, can occur. And I think we might think differently if we thought that way. And to me, it's very different. If we think about story, if we go, I'm going to write a screenplay now, and then I'll give it to you. We sit down and think we're going to write a plot. Then we write something very different than if we say, oh, the reason we're writing a plot is so that we can write a story. And that requires a theme that is beyond the story, to which the story points to while in the act of its in-storying, then the way we would go about the creative process would be quite different. And I think that's what we're kind of invited to think in the act of thinking. And if we always think that thinking must lead to contemplation, I think we might go about thinking differently.
Well said. I'm glad you did not let go of thought. And the reason I say that is I am beginning to find that thinking has its own athletics, or thinking has its own gymnastic. And what I mean by that is there are some modes of representation that are themselves representative of their own representation. And they want you to see that. That is how they gauge or measure their efficacy. So for example, if chess is a game whereby thinking ahead about where certain things ought to be in response to where other things are, and being able to Rolodex those places which are constant and those pieces which are constant in variable locations with respect to one another, then you can say you've played well if you're walking down those corridors. But there are other avenues of representation where the opposite is desired. And I enjoy bringing up professional wrestling because they will say, and the reason I analyze professional wrestling for my own contemplatio, along with other things that are quote unquote lowbrow or verging on the bureaucratic, is they're similar to dictionaries in a structuralist sense. They give you their lexicon. They're, as it were, yearning to be overcome, perhaps in a Hegelian mode. They are shining apples on the branch for us to notice how the parts are missing because they're being overdetermined, which is to say, shuffling over one another, leaping over one another. And so we get to ask that meta question very early, seen doing something else. And in fact, their inside language is, if you're seeing how I'm not hitting him as hard as I can with my right arm, then you're seeing through my attempt to hide from you the fact that I'm not hitting him as hard as I can with my right arm. And I find that fascinating because it shows me in a 3 dimensions what the project at stake is in telling story, in representing things, and the in-moment enactment of moments. It's very, one could gloss it as Hegelian through and through, just with living bodies. And so I wonder what you make of an analysis of daily life, daily things, to find those apples, as you said. And then where does the why become palpable, become a case of you're doing what you're proposing? Not to put you on the spot.
No, it's a great question. You know, a few things that came up for me. What's kind of interesting too is the idea that if I paint a landscape, you know, Hegel would say there's a negation there because the landscape in the painting does not include the movement of the tree with the breeze, the deer running across. And so he would encourage us that in the negation of the painting, we actually see better the living landscape because we see something missing in the painting. So in a way, the painting, when it's with the representation, when it's proper, draws attention to what is not in the representative. One could argue that a lot of problems today is people can't tell the difference between pictures of a birthday party and being at a birthday party. You know, this would be a sign that we're kind of missing the animating principle of the birthday party. And maybe that's us. And we're too busy taking pictures of being at a party to animate the party. So this would be a problem. And so the first kind of Hegelian move is that the negation discloses, like a good representation is almost seen more as a negation than a representation. Like that negation represents. In the removal of the breeze and the trees and the painting of the tree, the representative of the tree then discloses better in that negation the tree as movement. And so the first thing that comes to mind is how interesting it is that a representation, and Hegel would place that on the side of understanding, as he would call it, one-sided understanding or picture thought, versus reason, which is more trying to move beyond picture thought to dialectical movement. It is interesting to think that the representative, when it's proper, asks you to look beyond it, and that we almost as humans need representatives. It's like you intentionally need error in order to see truth. And Hegel's big on that. He says the one who's afraid of error will not see truth. And so likewise, I wonder if professional wrestling helps us see fighting better. precisely because it is representing something like this is a fight. This is, violence, but it's not. And in that negation, it kind of points to what real violence is. And what is gained in that negation is there's, maybe it's bad because you start thinking violence is just a game and then it's really not. Or maybe what you see is, oh, we don't actually need real violence because we can just enjoy professional wrestling. But I think that it might be a case-by-case thing on what the representative does to our relation with the actual thing, the actual substance, and paying attention. So the first thing I would say is to be aware that representations do, in fact, always change our relationship to the real thing. The world full of pictures of trees is not the same as the world that's just full of trees. Is it better? Is it worse? A change has occurred. And we have to ask ourselves the question, is it good? Is it bad? That also makes me think of paying attention to thought in the gymnastics of thought, because I think that's a very good language. I think obviously Plato is big on the gymnasium, and I think the gymnasium, conditionalism, as I'll talk, all of these things are, I think, the way to go about it. And if thought naturally, I do think there's something about thought that seems to naturally head toward one-sided representation, and it loses track of the relation between the representation and the actuality to know what it may gain in the movement or the comparison of the representation and the actuality. And so it doesn't analyze how the thought is structured compared to the actuality. And as a result, it's not able to have any marvel or wonder of that relation and the change that results from the existence of representation in light of actuality. It's not able to marvel at that. It doesn't think much of it. So capturing that feedback, that relation between the representation and the actual substance is one way for thought to marvel at itself. Wow, I'm able to make a representation of a thing. What must I be? Thought could ask itself. And I think one of the problems that can happen is we tend to live in a way where we cease to be mystified by thought and thinking. And if you're not mystified by it, I think it's hard to get to the contemplatio. For me, I guess when I was young, the first thing I'll say is like one of the most mystifying moments is when I realized I was reading the Redwall novel series and there was a movie playing in my head, and it kind of freaked me out. I had a moment where I was like, wait a minute, I'm looking at black words on white paper and I see a mouse with a sword. How is this possible? Like, where am I? That was kind of like, where am I when I'm watching this mouse run across the landscape? Where am I when this movie is playing in my head? And there was this like moment of realizing that you could be both here and there at the same time. And that to me was a very mystifying moment to realize that you could do this kind of bothness. So that moment of being mystified by the ability of thought to create a movie in my head and to make me able to be there in the movie and yet also here in the bathtub with all my blankets reading Redwall, that to me had the practical impact of making me realize that thought created worlds. Thought was always actually almost worlding. We tend to think of thought as just data points, gathering data points, 2 + 2 = 4. There's this kind of data gathering we associate with the structure of thought. But if you realize that thought is always passing over into something else, it seems like thought is passing over to create a world. Like the apple passes over into the color, to the shape, to the table, because what is it? It's like the thought is after worlding. And thought is trying to grow into a world and to kind of capture it all, which suggests that thought is like water filling a cup more than it is an answer to a problem. And so then the question becomes, how can we have thought engage in that worlding better? How can you have it kind of become expansive as opposed to finished? And to me, that's when thought is moving from plot to story. That's when it's moving from thematic to something beyond itself. And I think if you do that in your daily life, what it does is it makes you very skeptical of a finished thought. It makes you very skeptical of when you think you understand a person completely or a situation completely, or you think you're ready to judge it as complete. It makes you hesitant to finish things in that way. And in that way, I think it makes you more open. And in making you more open, it can make you alive, but not in a manner that's like anxious and uncertain and confused. But you're kind of marveling, really, in a kind of wonder way at the way that thought moves toward worlding, that it's always moving toward trying to speculate something beyond the representation. And then it's kind of a marvel to watch. And then when you encounter people, you let your thoughts about people move to the place where then they're in a world. And that world is their world, mind you. When you read Redwall, it's not your world, it's the world of the story. You're in Redwall, or you're in the Shire if it's Tolkien or something of that nature. And I think paying attention to how thought does that can also suggest that there's something about thought actually seeking community, seeking openness to the other, seeking to kind of world and place the other in that world. But you have to let thought do its thing, which of course is scary, because I think we want to control thought. And then how do you let thought do its thing and it not be chaos? Well, this makes me think, and then I'll give it back to you, this makes me think of the gym. There's some kind of training here that allows you to kind of feel when thought is worlding in a manner that communes, as opposed to chaos or diluted in a bad way, like diluted, or it's lost focus. There's some skill that's needed to sense the difference between thoughts that are worlding for the sake of community and otherness, and thoughts that are seeming to do that, but not doing that. So for me, practically, it does lead to trying to live in a way where you let thinking do its thing, in that sense. Let thinking become what it's trying to become, in worlding the other, in situating in that community. And I think that changes how you relate to things and people.
With the worlding, I was on a plane recently, and there is a difference in air current when you go a certain number of thousands of feet up. You are literally above the clouds, and there is cruising altitude. Then you go below, the light on the wings rotates and ricochets off the droplets, which are close beside each other, so it looks like a lightning bolt. And then you dip below the cloud, and suddenly you experience turbulence. You have that warp and woof to the left and to the right. You feel like an eddy. You feel not only that you've went down, but now you're down and moving around against will. You're feeling like now you are a passive subject. Whereas before I was active, with everything and nothing to do up there above the cloud. Now, this was something that I was experiencing, again, in a plane that was taking me from A to B. And this day, when I was walking up the staircase thinking about how I would bring something to the table in anticipation of the things you're bringing to the table, I said to myself, well, I had much trust in the plane and those in the plane, but not everyone in the plane. In fact, I didn't want to know about almost anything in the plane. But I had this trust, which, though I am sensitive and neurotic, and I did not want to step into the plane, and all I thought about was it blowing. All I thought about was grotesque, bizarre paintings of what could be from this mechanical, streamlined thing. I still stepped in because of quote unquote trust. Well, what is quote unquote trust? Because I could have laid on the back of the hard shell of a tortoise and said, giddy up, take me from A to B. Well, that sounds absurd and it sounds irrational. And not only do I think it beneath me to give a reason why I have no trust in that turtle taking me there, but I can't give an account to you why I would have more trust in the plane, other than the sort of picture thinking pointing of my finger. See, engine, see, goes up, see, goes there. I mean, see. And then someone, a Socrates would say, but why do you trust this mammoth thing that is not even alive, that has no responsivity to you? Why would you trust it more than this living organism? I know the living organism is slow, but at least it will respond to you. Why do you have less trust in this responsive thing than in this unresponsive thing, which you know in all possible worlds, quote unquote, will not respond to you? People manipulate it. Well, you don't even know the people. You're twice removed then from the thing. So again, I can appeal to the masses and to the phronema of my society. The doxa, the common belief is people trust planes. They're more trustworthy than cars. But when I'm pushed into a corner, I can't say why it's better than a tortoise, other than a picture thinking sort of brute fact presentation. Unless another person could think of a more articulate way that isn't begging the question or beating around the bush, but actually giving a reason why it's better, other than the fact that it gets me there. Because if we argue by the ends justifying the means, then we haven't begun to ask the question you said Hegel invites us to ask, which is why thought passes over. So the relation of the why to the goal, and when we experience the why as a living question, when the why by negation becomes the balancing beam that I'm now suspending my body up from my hands and then bringing my legs down one after the other to pick myself and upright my arms back where the legs were, which is where they belonged in the first place, above my shoulder. This somersault, when does it occur cognitively? And of course, I'm not asking for a brain scan, but in the ordinary, we wake up, we drink from the same cup, we sit down and we eat and we have a diet and we blah, 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 blah. You notice we can gloss these things. And yet it is within these things that we can find kernels, we can find nested logics, we can find recursion. Is that discovery mapping out the space that Hegel is trying to point us to? Because again, I think you and I are circling around the notion of space. Mm-hmm. And in Greek, of course, there are two words that come to mind that evoke a distinction in space. A core, not only a C-O-R-E, which is a sort of space in space, but a chorus, a space off-center, commenting and curving towards the space from it, as the painting of the landscape curves us from the painting to what might be, which is not the same thing as the actual forest. Oh, what might have been, so now we're bringing the dialectic into ourselves, what might have been if I had paid attention to the way the wind sound between the pine needles while I was there. So I'm now summarizing the Aristotelian categories of place, time, relation, as a matter of thought, in negating the landscape, which is a representation. But is that an experience of the why? And if so, is it done in repose? Or is it done in extreme anxiety, which is the opposite of repose, that to my mind, Kierkegaard tries to make us experience or think or arrive at? And I do think Kierkegaard is a philosopher of transitions. So it pleases me to end on that note.
That was lovely. There's a few things that come to mind. First off, the airplane imagery is quite nice because there's a way in which there's ways to have your thought carry you into different air currents. Certain thoughts encounter and experience the air different than others. And that right there is quite a thought. Whoa, thought can unfold, occurring to different air currents with different experiences. Thought that is not aware of thought has one air current. Thought that is aware of thought has another air current. and thought that is aware of thought, and that thought must be aware of thought. And whoa, that's really weird. That has a different turbulence, maybe. There's a different air current in that. It's also very interesting to think that you get on a plane, there is a trust. And why do you have that trust versus something else? Well, there's some sort of community. There's some other people do it. And it's almost like, well, because I've seen it worlding. I've seen planes in the world that has been carried. And so thought can kind of rest on the idea of using this to get to your destination versus a turtle. But then, like you say, that's tied to trust. And I actually think the relationship between trust and thought seems quite big, actually. You have to trust thinking, because if not, it eats itself, right? I mean, if you always question or don't trust what you're thinking, or what if I'm thinking this, or what if I'm deceived, you're kind of, lost, right? You can always deconstruct yourself. And so to not trust thought is very bad. But then there's a trusting of thought that's never willing to ask, what is thought doing? Because you're like, well, I trust it. I don't need to ask that. Which in one way confirms the trust, but in another way is problematic, because then you're never disclosed to this other element of thought. Where what Socrates seems to come along and he say, yes, you trust that, but why do you trust that? And you go, well, I trust it because I don't ask, precisely, Socrates, because I don't ask why about it. That's why I trust it. And you're asking me, why do I trust? Because I trust. But why do I trust? And suddenly, boom, the Passover has occurred. And now it's almost like you occupy a different space. But you entered this space precisely because you questioned what you trusted. So can you trust this? Would you just be repeating the same mistake? How do you trust this? And I like the choria, so, I think Derrida speaks of the space in a space kind of thing that you suddenly find yourself in. And to me, that does definitely bring to mind the experience of realizing I'm in a movie in my head. I trust this movie I'm in. I'm reading this book. And then you go, wait, I'm in this movie. How is this part? Where am I? And likewise, I think a lot of times, in the circling or the dialogos, there's a realization of, wait, we've passed over into a space. Where are we? Whoa, where are we? What's going on? Like with guys sense like, what happened? Now we're somewhere. This conversation is not, it's a space within a space. There's conversation that's a space. Oh, we're talking about our day and how's everything going? And now suddenly we're in a space within a space. Likewise, when you read a book and it's a really good book, there's a funny way in which a good book is precisely when the words on the page are invisible. You stop seeing them. Like if you see a word on the page, then it's almost something is broke. I think James Wood called it, well, he did. It's the trance of believability. Like once the trance of believability snaps, you remember that you're reading. Like good reading is almost an act of forgetting that you read. And then you go, wait, where was I? How was I reading when I forgot that I was reading? Where was I? What was this space that I was in where this was occurring? I think in daily life, with this kind of passing over, things can what Hegel kind of invites us to ask is, if things are always passing over into something else, then how are they there? Like, how are they stable in some sense? An apple is an apple, and yet you can't define it without it. What is an apple? You go to the parts, and the parts only make sense with the whole. So everything's always passing over into one another, and yet it's there, right? How? Likewise, when you're in a space within a space, what are you talking about? There's just a space, and yet you are in a space. And so in one's daily life, if you take all this seriously, it seems like it is possible to live a life that is here and there at the same time, that is in two places at once. And I think that can disclose itself in living a kind of life that is looking for that and that is open to that, that would change the quality of your experience of the world and other people. And so then it's a very interesting question to me, because it kind of almost suggests, can you, one, teach that? Can you teach the ability of the bothness? I'm looking for a term. The here, there, I call it the here, there sometimes. The both, like the T is in parentheses. It's the there, here. It's a both going on. I think of it that way. Maybe I'll just call it the space for now. I'll call it this space. Can you teach that? Can you get better at that? Can you will it? Can you have it come to define more and more of your qualities of life all throughout the day? Is that sainthood? Is that Kairos time? Like, what is all of those confirmations that maybe the saints had, maybe they weren't wrong. I have moments where I feel like those moments of experiencing that point to this, man, the saints knew there was something going on. When everyone talked about the beauty, it's like, yeah, there is that reality there. There is something there that it kind of points to. And then it becomes a question of, is that an art that you can master and live, or only one that you can kind of glimpse here and there? I'd be curious what comes up for you. These are thoughts that come to mind.
They are the questions of my early 30s. They are.
Yeah.
They are valuable to me.
Mm.
The closet you put your clothes in. Where are the clothes? What is the closet? I take some out, I put them in. Throughout life, different clothes will go in, different clothes will come out. I say I have my favorite pair of jeans. I make these locutions. I walk into the closet. I close the door sometimes. All I'm waiting for is a paraphrase, is a allusion or direct quotation from Shakespeare now in the Western canon. The exits, the entrances, the parts we play. And I do not want to say that we are things to be shuffled off from, and then the drop returns to the ocean, and the closet was seen as a microcosm of the void. I don't believe that, because now we can talk about trust, belief, doxa, community, to use your word. And then the word I want to bring into that cadre, participation, and how that word has been inflected for me in my close reading of Saint Maximus the Confessor, who I think is a jarring element to the history of philosophy as we have known it, delivered to the United States from Europe. To me, America is a pragmatic seedbed of philosophy. It's philosophy that has desired to lift the hood of the car and say, what can I say that is of any import to the institutions around me, which, like me, are fledgling, which, like me, are new? We don't have to break new ground in America, because compared to Europe, we are beyond and before all of it. We came here on our own volition. And so Hume doesn't work well in America, in my opinion. I don't know, you might disagree with me. But I mean, I see Pierce, Dewey, Rorty, and Rorty to me is, much could be said about all of them, they're geniuses, but Rorty to me is the accordion player of where they depart and where they return to each other in Rorty's statement, or Rorty's ability to quickly identify when a philosopher is changing the subject without knowing. And so it's a kind of faux pas. But a faux pas is meaningful to the degree that the institution is in place and aware of itself in that one current you had mentioned. If it's not aware of itself, a faux pas is meaningless and less until it evaporates. And it's not a faux pas. But you can also have this high-pitched of a possible faux pas that then becomes a revolutionary strike. And I think Rorty captured that when he talked about philosopher changing the subject, but then in order to not go on this witch hunt of who's changing the subject, let's just knuckle down and explore, devise, and identify social practices, and make as many provisions for niche communities as possible. Because isn't that the promise of a representational democracy? That each possible tweak or movement or angle would not only be enlightened, but have a place supported, and honored. Without the baggage of who comes from what bloodline and all the stuff we associate with old world. However, when one does this so efficiently, one comes into, I think, the snake eating its tail and the meta reflections that we are in at the popular culture level, which I do not say with any dismissiveness. To me, it's a great big magnifying glass of what has been in culture, in the sense of in biology culture, petri dish, for a while, which is to say, on Netflix, there is a show called The Morning Show, which is about the morning show. So the morning show is this news outlet, and the show on Netflix is about a fictional world that is that news outlet and what goes on behind the curtain, the petty rivalries, all the Shakespearean drama, behind the Shakespearean drama. And I say behind Shakespearean drama because the morning show often talks about the other news show and their interpretation of a common fact and their take on it, which is more correct than the other take on it, and the necessity to provide rhetorical heft to their view. Before, it was about, I see this rock. I would like to know more about this rock, but I want to specifically know what to do with this rock as someone in America, a frontiers person with some institution fledgling. But now it's one way the media will augment a perception because their why behind the augmentation is supposed to be better than the other. And now there's this show which takes that as common knowledge of the attempt and makes entertainment from it. So we have this hyper sense of our own doings that I do not think is plowing the ground. It's not clearing the way for a disclosure. I think it is occluding and replicating, much like the Legos replicating the NES, which makes or replaces why with nostalgia. Hence the popularity of, say, True Detective and this wandering, aimless nihilist who somehow does the right thing at the right time when no one else, with their cultural values, I mean baggage, will. And this appeal of that lone wolf, once again, which was supposedly why we all, quote unquote, came here in our common mythos, right? So a Hegel scholar might say, well, we're repeating the dialectic. Good for us, right? We've come to where our ancestors began. Good, now we can begin. I think with technology, these movements are becoming fossils before they are fossils. Their digitization is the fossil without dust. And this is a weird form of rust. It's a weird form of stagnation. What do you think of that diagnosis, that through the gnosis of where this gnosis might be going? What? Take me out of myself.
You said a lot of really important things. The first thing that came to mind as you were describing this kind of meta, this kind of infinite thing. It's interesting how it's kind of a counterfeit of beauty, isn't it? Where beauty is where the mystery, right? Where mystery has this, the more you learn, the more there is to learn. Like beauty is invitational, where there's always more to learn and you can go when life has meaning and there's a participation in this ever growing, this ever expanding horizon. It's interesting to think that this kind of new meta thing has there's always another meta. There's always another meta. There's always another analysis. And it seems similar in form to beauty or mystery. It's like meta or mystery in this way, and yet it's a counterfeit of it. It's a kind of counterfeit. And it seems to be what, you know, if we use Christian language, what sin does. Sin always has a kind of another level, meta. You go on, you know, if sin is the loss of being, well, there's a lot, you can always lose more being. So there's something where you're going on, and it's almost like a world that doesn't go to the gem of beauty, still ends up with something like beauty. It's just not mystery. It's this meta, this ever meta-ness that seems to be going on. I think that's it actually is extremely appropriate to bring up with Hume. You are correct that Hume does not fit in America. Unfortunately, we have defined Hume as an empiricist, a utilitarian, and a pragmatist, so we don't really understand his program. Richard Rorty, you mentioned it very well. He had a lot of faith in democracy and liberalism and diversity and pluralism and so on and so forth. And there's a lot to be said about his effort to try to make a free, liberal, democratic society. These were parts of his efforts. But I think Mark Edmondson had a really good essay in the Atlantic or Harper, I'm not sure. And he's a poetry professor at UVA, very good man. He's written some tremendous books on football, on teacher, Freud. He's a really, really great thinker, Mark Edmondson. He was just pointing out that neo-pragmatism can't stop a strongman. It can't stop a totalitarian dictator because you can't talk about post-truth if it's useful. If post-truth or post-fact is useful, why not use it? If conspiracy is useful for your agenda or to control people, why not use it? Because you say, because it's false. Oh, there's no such thing as capital T truth. Maybe there's some truth to it. You need to go explore it. And what ends up happening, pragmatism cannot save you from what I call the pitch and risk, based on the crying lot of, Thomas Pynchon, who I think is very important, the crying of lot 49. Once you see a trumpet, that's a symbol of some agenda. How can pragmatism save you from exploring that? Once some sort of dictator comes along and says, I'm going to make everything right again, how would pragmatism save you from that? How would neo-pragmatism save you from that? You can't. And so, but the funny thing is, David Hume's whole project is about basically self-defense. It's not mere pragmatism. It's about philosophy as self-defense of the common life, because the values of life come from the lived experience, and philosophy is more like self-defense. In the treatise of, and this is not American pragmatism. American pragmatism is not, it is not a self-defense of things that are beyond the parameters of simplistic linear thinking.
I agree with you.
So for David Hume, there is something, quote unquote, practical about self-defense, but it's also not reducible to mere practical or utility. What David Hume does in the Treatise of Human Nature is you see, one of the problems with Mr. Hume is he makes these really important distinctions and then doesn't mention them for 400 pages and then mentions them again. And so you're like, oh, that mattered? I didn't get that one. Well, there's a distinction between good and bad philosophy. And a good philosophy is a self-defense from thinking that's trying to come in and take control of your common life or change how you live your life or change your relation to mystery. And you're able to fight it off because you're able to reason and use thought to kind of deconstruct it. It's like deconstruction. Deconstruction is self-defense from tyranny, as opposed to deconstruction as cutting off the limb you're sitting on or something. And bad philosophy is the philosophy that comes in and says, well, why not be meta? Why not be meta? Bad philosophy for David Hume leads to what he calls philosophical consciousness, which for him is actually bad because it abstracts you from life, makes you a judge of life. Life is always inadequate to philosophical ideals, so you always deconstruct it and you fall. Then when you build something again, you fall, and you're always going further and further down the meta deconstruction. So David Hume's understanding of philosophy is precisely that it is supposed to save you from something like the ever meta that defines the modern world today. You see this endless meta-ing that has the same form as mystery, and precisely because it has the same form, it's so dangerous, right? Lucifer is an angel of light. Why is, Lucifer wouldn't be much of a threat if he couldn't show up as an angel of light. You go, he looks kind of scary. I'm not going to listen to that guy. So he doesn't show up that way. It has to have some sort of formal appeal, right? Ever meta-ness feels like depth. Ever meta-ness feels like you're going somewhere. In a way you are. But where you're going is nowhere. You're going to nowhere. And then that also is the opposite space as the space in the space we talked about, right? Meta will lead you. You're now inside the morning show. You're inside the morning show, inside the morning show. So there's a space and a space and a space, but it's the negative direction. It's the opposite direction. You're occupying a new space, but it's the privation of the space within a space that we were describing earlier. That we were describing the character of the circling and the dialogos and the mystery feels like you're in a kera, the space within a space. The meta makes a similar feeling, but it's a perversion. And so this is where one must be as wise as serpents. One must be able to tell the difference between the meta and the mystery. And unfortunately, American pragmatism cannot provide that. It cannot provide that because it is frankly removed the possibility of capital T truth. Now, Mr. Rorty is quite clear that just because we can't think capital T truth doesn't mean it exists. What he says, it doesn't interest him, or it's not relevant, or it's not important. Well, as soon as that totalitarian force shows up, it may be important, but then it's too late because you have not entertained in the gymnasium the skills needed in order to appeal to that mystery beyond, because you also cannot order your life according to it. And so you have no defense against the meta forces that would tempt you into something that seems like a mystery because it keeps going and going and going, but it actually just goes nowhere. So for me, the tragedy is that American pragmatism is not Humean because we don't know Humean. Now, of course, I think it's in the resume that anyone who does philosophy, their favorite philosopher is misread. You know, that's in the resume, you know, you have to say that. But I do think following Livingston and Norman Kemp Smith, you know, there's a whole literature on David Hume as a defender of common life, as he called it. And by that, he basically means the concrete lived experience. He's trying to make it clear to you that you cannot establish cause and effect with thought so that you honor cause and effect in life. He's not saying there is no such thing as cause and effect. He's saying you can never arrive at it in thought. You arrive at it in experience. So maybe thought is in service of experience, not the other way around. He's saying you can never arrive at a self if you try to just think a self. A self is found in the lived. He's not saying there is no such thing as these things. He's saying that these things are different than what you think. They are more alive and experiential, and they are there than you realize. And so thought should be in service of that as opposed to try to usurp that, because if you try to usurp that, you end in the ever meta. You lose mystery and gain the meta. And because it feels like it's going somewhere, because it's always going to nowhere, you feel like you're making progress as you're getting lost. And the moment you think you're making progress as you're getting lost, it is very difficult to get unlost, because now you're going in the wrong direction and are super convinced that you're going in the right direction. And you don't even have the gymnastic skills to hear someone tell you wrong way. And then at that point, one is vulnerable to all sorts of manipulations. So to give it back to you, I think a proper understanding of Hume can help us avoid the ever meta that you see. That is not the occupation of this space within a space that's so holy and important, but it is a kind of occupation of a space within a space in the privation negative, in the wrong. And it also goes to show you the following: you will participate in something. You're either going to participate in mystery or the ever meta. Choose well. And you cannot not choose. And if you're not paying attention and if you're not aware of that, you're going to be participating in one of those and thus bringing it more so into the world than the other. And is that what you want? I would participate in the mystery versus the ever meta.
We are in a good place, in my opinion. One of my takeaways from tonight will be the distinction you pronounced with meta and mystery. I learned as I ponder, I will be learning ever more how to play the piano, how to break the code of that binary. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thoughts come to mind. Hume, yes. I agree with the way you rehearsed Hume, the thing you extruded from Hume as exemplary of Hume, and what we would come to expect from Hume as a Humean reader, I'm there with you. To my mind, someone, a living philosopher, our contemporary, who would play pool with him is Graham Harman, now teaching at SciArc. He is someone whose lectures I've listened to, and I find him stimulating, perhaps for the reasons or for the neighborhood of reasons you gave to Hume as the means by which he stimulated your thinking going forward. So with Graham, the point of similarity I would, with a broad brush stroke upward, is Harman wants to talk about the untalkable. And he wants to keep doing that in order to, one, indicate the untalkable as worthy of attention, which makes all the talkable discourses, talkable enactments that he does, in service to the making valorous, the making worthy of attention that the thing not said is. And one can hear that and say, I don't want to play that game. And another person will hear it and say, that's the only game I want to play. Because finally, my latent, I want this to be heard almost Freudian, almost, my latent apophaticism has had nothing to grind its teeth upon until I found a suitable puzzle to change colors with. Right? Because where does the apophatic belong? And to my mind, the apophatic is not the same as the eliminative. It's not a liming. So apo, from, the Greek language is wonderful for its prefixes. They tell you so much. Geometrically, they tell you so much. The apo is not a not. It's not an A. It's showing a movement, a kinesis, a gymnastic technique. You're going just like the word cataphatic or catastrophe has with it a story in the prefix.
Yeah.
Just waiting to be passed over in whatever I'll say. And everything I'll say is a landscape painting directing to what could be in that little prefix dangling for me. Cata doesn't mean with or according to in some Boolean logic. It's not a Carnap. It didn't know of Carnap. It's a down thrust. So, or just going down, maybe being specific from a general, whatever system you have, it starts to tell you where you're going with the strophe, which is another kind of, what is the word? In staging a play where it's a choreography. So core, graph, and then you have the cata. So you do so much with so little, and it almost invites a Hegelian passing over with all the things we'll say in prose. Okay. Harman wants to talk about the untalkable object which withdraws from the qualities. So he gives the apple as example. It's red, it's juicy, it can be held in your hand, it's somewhat spherical, blah, 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 blah. We can gloss the qualities. But even as I eat it, I don't pretend to say, and that's all there is. Because for no other reason than I don't trust myself saying that. I believe that I will learn more if I cared to. There probably are an infinite number of possible worlds where I would find in each possible world a unique reason, a unique utility in knowing something different about that apple. Maybe Rorty would agree. In a post-truth world, there probably is an infinite array of utilities I would find in a said apple, but none of them are useful except one. Well, even that language doesn't, Harman would say, exhaust the object known as apple. It transcends it. It's not there in the pile of qualities that I talk about when I talk about apple. It's nowhere in there. Like Kant said, existence is not a predicate. So give me a bag of gold, you'll give me everything except the existence of a bag of gold. You'll give me gold coins, you'll give me heavy things, but you won't give me the existence. That was his pun of a bag of gold. Because where is the predicate of existence? If it's everywhere, then it's nowhere. So it's a problem, existence, talking about it, predicating it. We don't know what we're doing when we do so. So Harman wants to, he says, drive a wedge between the qualities and the object. Now, why am I saying this in relation to Hume? I'm asking now you the question, is making, if I were to say this word with the spin that Vervaeke gives to it, Dr. Vervaeke, if I make all this affordance for the distance between the object and its qualities, if I say they are always just in tension, and rather than talk about aesthetics, I shouldn't waste my time. I should talk about art appreciation. Because art appreciation already and always will be caught up in the problem of the puzzle between what the author, what the artist made, and what I am experiencing via the art. Whether it's 100 years after the death, post-mortem, or if it's contemporary in the first sketch. I seem to be faced as an appreciator with the problem of the tension between the qualities and the supposed object. But now as we puzzle over which qualities are closer to, are they a sort of ladder leading up to the object? Are we meta-ing? Are we going up rungs of meta, which is a rabbit trail that America in its pragmatism, which is not Humean, can make a good buck on? And there's a place for a Marxian critique of it, always to find the bases and super bases of the structures. Marlborough was sold this way, right? And it had landscape paintings of deserts and people on camels to sell us poisonous sticks. So there were, think of the number of metas between that poisonous stick and that guy with the 5 o'clock shadow with the cowboy hat. So many metas. We're a nation rationating on metas, but I love it. I enjoy living where I live. I say this out. I think it's interesting where we live philosophically, which again comes back to your question of where are we? So my question to you that I'm asking and re-asking again is that if you allow for the object, a transcendental, let us say, which is not identical to the summation of its qualities, but ever is in tension with those qualities somehow, is the attempt to puzzle over that, appreciate that, a meta approach, or is it the mystery that we should be contemplating and engaging with? Or would you find a third term, a different way to talk about this thing? Need it involve binaries as qualities, objects, or do we need some tertiary, some thirdly thinking? Go ahead.
That's an excellent question. And I do think object-oriented ontology, the triple O, Harman, all that is fascinating. And there's something to be learned there that has been missed. Because we're Harman in this way that, you know, the big thing he always talks about is we say, oh, we can't get to the things themselves. Well, it's like, well, not even things can get to the things themselves, right? So that, the in self, there's always this inaccessibility, that in its inaccessibility, then it's accessible. It's the ground of the terms by which all things interact. And if we want to kind of get at what is the proper relations of objects, he's kind of asking the question of, well, we need to pay attention to how objects relate to objects, not how humans relate to objects, that there's some sort of horizon philosophically that has not been considered. And the question becomes the following. I think you put that's an excellent question. Is that line of inquiry leading to the ever meta, as I'll call it, or is it leading to mystery? Well, There seems to be one side of it where there's a ever meta, where if you think about the subject independent of the object, you end up in the meta, which is, you could even say that's the phenomenology of worry, right? Like, what is fear? Like where the Bible talks about fear, there's something about fear that can never be disproven. You always may die, right? You can always be worried. There's something about the phenomenology of worry that suggests the ever meta when it's the subject to the subject. Because if you're, say, afraid of not getting a job or being afraid of not getting into college, what can anyone say to you? Like, if you're afraid of something, you basically decide when you stop being afraid of it, right? So like fear seems like the phenomenology of worry is always fascinating to me, because worry seems to be the possibility of the subject to the subject engaging in an ever meta, which is problematic. The object, the question is, does triple O ontology, Harmon, does that somehow do the same mistake in object to object? Is the ever meta always found in a thing to itself? And is the mystery found in a thing to other? That seems to be what Hegel, like if we think Hegel, what Hegel is like is whenever you try to have a thing to itself, not thing to otherness, you end up in an ever meta. The mystery is found in a subject to object, of which then the subject goes back. This is a way to think, a way I'll talk about it with absolute knowing. Consciousness looks at the apple and says, I can never get to the apple itself. What must consciousness be to be incapable of getting to the apple itself? Wow, consciousness is unveiling this apple for me to learn something about itself, and being incapable of getting to the object in itself, I have learned positive knowledge about myself thanks to otherness. You look at the apple, you see that it's red. Oh, consciousness is a thing that's able to experience color. Wow, what does that mean about consciousness? The other, then without the other, you cannot ask the right questions about yourself. The other is what makes it possible to ask the right questions about yourself, which then you can calibrate yourself relative to those questions to then relate to the apple differently, which then opens up new questions back and forth, back and forth. And that movement is not ever meta, because meta is thing to thing. This is the mystery of relation now, because consciousness is looking at the object of an invitation to realize what consciousness is capable of. It's capable of experiencing color, for example, that it cannot be egotistical about that, because it is only possible to realize that about itself because of the object. The object has given the ability of the experience of color to consciousness, and so there's a gratitude and there's a humility. Avoiding the ever meta seems to have a lot to do with humility. Consciousness never goes, because the moment consciousness goes, or the subject, these different terms, the moment they say, the world doesn't exist, that's not humble at all. That's incredibly arrogant. You're saying there is no world, just my own mind, right? But also, the moment you say, there is no subject, I can only think of the object to itself, you're denying the gift of the object for the subject to learn about itself. If you only look at the apple to the apple, you are denying the gift that the apple is giving you to learn that consciousness is a thing that can experience color. There's a gift you're denying. And it actually is a sin in a way to deny gift. If God offers you grace and you say, I'm not worthy of grace, I shouldn't get it, no, there's a point in which that's good. But then there's actually a point where that turns into a sin, because you're actually then kind of refusing grace. You're refusing the joy that's giving you in his son. And so there's a ditch on either side of the road. So what's also critical, what you brought about the existence with Anselm and the critique of Kant on Anselm and different things, Hegel in the Science of Logic will say the problem with that is Kant's understanding of existence is the existence of the things as they know it. When you say you can't just add existence to the apple that's already there, that's true. But what if there's a different kind of existence that could be added to the apple that it doesn't know because it hasn't passed over into speculative reason? Let me explain what I mean by that. When you have an association with people, you mentioned the word with. I always find it very interesting, because the word with, it's very hard to think of an English word that actually, there are different kinds of with. You can be with people that you don't know and it's just an associate, but then there's a with a person that's this deeper space within a space, right? This deeper kind of friendship, you could say, right? Both the word with but it's not the same with, and yet it's not captured in the language. And what Hegel would say is, if you were to say, oh, you can't add existence to withness. No, because it's already included. But there's actually a different existence of with you could add to it if you were disclosed to it. So when Anselm kind of sits down and says God is the kind of being that cannot exist, he's not talking about the existence that apples have and just being themselves. He's talking about a quality of existence that is different in kind, that only God can have as a sensible concept. And then the choice is if you will get on your knees or not, because it is only from your knees that you have access to that kind of existence, because you have to meet a certain condition to enter the space within a space. If you want to have access to the existence of witness, that is friendship versus association, you have to do things. You have to be open to the other. You have to work on your arrogance. You have to go to the gym. What Anselm is saying, as Karl Barth put it, and I think he's correct about this, Anselm is saying that the existence that God must have is an existence that can only be known from one's knees. And the issue is, you don't have to get on your knees, though. But if you get on your knees, the kind of existence that discloses itself to you is a different quality of existence that in its very disclosure suggests it must exist because you just experienced it. And so the being of whom that is on the gradient of is what we refer to as God. Now, then the person comes along and says, you're just brainwashing yourself. And the person would say, no, I'm in a mystery. They would say, no, you're in a meta. And here's the thing. If you've never had a friendship that has that different quality of witness, you can't tell the difference between meta and mystery. You are not able to tell the difference between existence like apples have and existence like God has, because it requires the conditioning to have that experience. And what Hegel is saying, Kant, you have assumed that there is only one kind of existence. You have assumed that things can have only one quality of existence, which would be like saying there is only one meaning of the word witness. But if you meet the conditions of friendship, you know that the witness of an associated work is not the same witness as a friend, because you have met the condition to disclose yourself to that existence, because you have learned from the other how to have that existence in the same way that you may have learned from the apple that consciousness is a thing that can experience color. Now you have been disclosed to the possibility of a witness, ergo existence, that you have now met. And it must be there because you met it. But you do have to decide what it means. Does it mean that God died on a cross? Does it mean that God is just maybe some sort of ether in the great void? I mean, Anselm does not necessarily give you the movement from God to Jesus, but he does say that the mystery must exist if you can get on your knees and experience it. But the question is that mystery just meta or is it not? Those who have gotten on their knees know the difference. But you have to get on your knees to know the difference. You know the difference between the ever meta and the mystery if you've tasted both, right? But you have to taste both to know the difference. And that's the act of faith. That's why you can only know God through faith, because you can only through faith engage in the actions that would disclose you to the mystery that would unveil there are different kinds of existences. One is the ever meta, one is the mystery. Well, if that difference is experienced, then there must be a distinction, because you just experienced it. And if you just experienced it, it must exist. And you can't say it's a predicate, because a moment ago you had an existence that was different in quality, and it wasn't, and the existence you are now disclosed to was not part of the existence you just had. You cannot say that mystery is part of just the ever meta because you've experienced the difference. You can't say the existence is qualitatively the same. It is different there, but it can only be known from the knees. It can be only known in those who diligently seek them, not because it's some sort of trick, but because literally the world is disclosed in how we condition ourselves to it. The way that the object is a revelation to us in gift is relative to the way that we hold it and are toward it in communion. And so for me, avoiding what all that would get, as I've spoken about before, is you're seeing a situation. Mystery is a situation in the Leibniz geometrical sense. Mystery is found in the geometrical. The ever meta is found in the algebraic. And what Hegel is saying, Kant's mistake is saying, is like, oh, in the algebraic, existence is a predicate. And he's like, yes, but you can't say that that's the only kind of existence. Anselm is talking about the existence of geometry. And you cannot say that, and yes, geometrical existence to geometry is a predicate, but to algebra, it's not. It is a different thing. And you're forgetting the transition. And so Hegel is like, the moment Ansel gets down on his knees, he is open to the existence of geometry, not from algebra. And you cannot say the existence, the quality of geometry is just a predicate to algebra unless you've never got on your knees. Once you get on your knees, you know the difference between the ever meta in the mystery. And so for me, Graham Harman helps us move in the direction of the situation. But if we stay in object to object, we're going to have an ever meta. If we stay in the subject to subject, we'll have an ever meta. But object-oriented ontology can help us move in the direction of the overall geometrical situation in which the mystery is disclosed. So I think there's a negation sublation that has to occur with the triple O ontology into the situation, but it's not left behind, and it's not part of the conversation. But I do think it has to move into the question of, what does the experience of red say about consciousness to itself, that because of the experience of red, I've received a gift that helps me know myself, and thus I am grateful for the world, and now I can better fit myself in it to experience the mystery of it. Those are thoughts that come to mind.
In the coming to appreciate the red of the apple, I whirled a world. Present. Otherwise, a fortiori, however you say that word, the inference could not be made. Because again, philosophy, to my mind, for my money, is the re-asking of the question again and again, how do I infer at all? And whether it's couched in the language of cause and effect, and how do I go from there to here, or other ways, I still think I'm asking myself, what is the derivation? What is the inference I'm making? Am I really making it? Or am I deluding myself into believing that I am making it? Which is a mediopassive middle voice way of saying, am I walking down the street? Is there a street I am walking on? You get to the dative case, you get to that. You get all this stuff out of, I think, asking, is the inference holding water? Now, I like how you positioned Harman and triple O. And I think I'm saying what you said with different words when I say, I treat the speculative realists as modern prolegomenon to any future metaphysic. Kant had to write one. And I think without writing it, Graham Harman has written it. But instead of metaphysic, now, upon reflection, I would say to any future. To my mind, metaphysic is becoming increasingly clear as the search for an apophatic language that isn't meta. So it has its own problematic built in, which I think motivates the question, where does the apophatic belong? And notice it's a question of place. And I take this from Llaneras, not Christos Llaneras. His name escapes me. He wrote Experience in the Absolute. He's part of the French theological turn. He's contemporary. He makes much hay, and I mean that as a compliment, out of the discovery, the recent discovery in mathematics of topology, or at least a way of talking about spaces and places, which then gave rise, I would argue, to a reinforced intuition of category in category theory, which is the prima facie rediscovery of, let's talk about Leibniz, the universal calculator, universal ratiocination. He did it his way as he was anticipating calculus, talking about those air currents, fitting curves, blah, 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 all this language, which was language like the landscape, not about the landscape, but about how it was to be there, by now bringing in the negative. Curve fitting calculus, I think that's a way of talking about the many and the one, but through negation. And I think we're doing it again. Perhaps this is another passing over. because the object in object is like a fluxion fluxion. The many, many. Why don't we talk about oil spills and clumps of dirt? They should have rights too, epistemic rights, Harman would say, flat ontology. A fly landing on some defecation and a crown. Why aren't these things on the same level in his mind? They're objects, infinitely withdrawn, if we want to use that that idealist language of infinite. All right. Again, I think that's a clearing of the way. A saying, well, there's so much flux, we need a universal calculus. So again, prolegomena to a proper apophaticism that takes seriously the notion of place, which, to quote that philosopher who wrote Experience in the Absolute, whose name I forget, space is not the same thing as place. Space is not synonymous with place. Topos, from topology, is where the logics are, the logi. To quote now, to bring in Saint Maximus, the logi are distinct places that make the syllogism possible in his construal. Because the syll, like symbiosis with the logi, the logic. So how do you do something with logic? Well, we think we know, with a superficial reading of the Enlightenment, we think we know what we mean when we say, well, there is good reason or not good reason. But if we take that reason word out of it and say, with logos, without logos, what are we talking about? It starts to become a little Halloween-esque. Oh, that word's like a plastic mask. You're saying it to sound different than you sound 363 other days, 364 other days, right? Normally you would say reason, but now you're saying logos. And instead of derivation, you're talking about with the logos going. How do we not make this sound so niche and word candy? I think that's another way of rehearsing the problem of moving from these metas we're down staircased in, spiral staircase down in, to what we're all asking without knowing it. What is the proper apophatic stance toward creation? And when I said creation there, it didn't sound proselytizing to me. It didn't sound evangelical even. It actually sounded born on the wings of the negations of meta. Creation starts to make sense to my ear. But it's not until and unless I go through these metas that creation starts to sound like something other than Greg Holbein and the Bible Project. I'm not dismissing them. I'm just saying it doesn't sound so construed and contrived. But I think this brings us to what you said about Hegel and the landscape.
I think bringing in category theory topography is exactly correct. William Rupas, Dr. Hammerich, when we talked in the Science of Logic lectures, is very funny because it's quite clear in the Doctrine of Being that basically what Hegel is saying is that if we want to do logic 2,000 years after Aristotle, requires something like topography. I think it's an excellent association. I think the problem is, if we take Aristotle as the birthplace of metaphysics, we forget that metaphysics is what follows from the physics. If you notice that everything is always changing and all you experience is change, then what in the world are you referring to when you talk about a cup? And metaphysics is fundamentally lack-based, because the form that makes a cup is not in phenomenology, it's not in experience. All you experience is time and becoming. And yet there is a cup that is a cup, and it's fundamentally a lack. Like in Aristotle, the term lack, obviously there's a psychoanalytical take in Lacan and different people, but there's also lack for Aristotle of being, nothing, and lack is a present absence. It's not the same as nothing. Nothing is like, so for example, if you're hungry, then the fact there isn't a sandwich in a room is not nothing, it's lacking. If you're not hungry and there's not a sandwich in the room, then it's nothing. But your orientation transforms when nothing is a lack, based on if you're hungry or looking for it. So nothing is a present absence. It's a thing that's not there, that in its not being there is there. And what's very interesting is in Aristotle, when he talks about form, and obviously in metaphysics, you have substance, form, and essence that simultaneously in a weird way are the same thing, but not the same thing, kind of Trinitarian, and it's all fun like that. But then all of that is constituted by a present absence. There, when you look at the cup, you can't point at the substance, and yet you can. It's there and it's not there. And Aristotle's asking, where is the location of this apathetic, basically? The metaphysics is a fundamental, where do we locate this thing that is not there? When we talk about a cup, we're locating it in that particular change over there that is that object on the shelf. It's there. That's where the present absence is. The issue is today is when Aristotle was writing, you could argue that the topography was given. They had not forgotten the territory. It's almost like today we have forgotten the territory. We have forgotten the world upon which we are walking, so we have to regain it through topography and then do metaphysics. But it would require a laying of the land before you move, because for Aristotle, another way to look at metaphysics and logic is navigation. They're navigations. How do you navigate yourself in an argument? How do you navigate yourself amongst all this information? How do you navigate yourself or rely on anything in all of this change? And why should you rely on anything in all of this change? In that way, it is fundamentally anti-meta, because meta is everything falls away. You can't rely on anything. Metaphysics is how do you navigate to avoid the ever meta, really, the ever change? Because if everything's always changing, then that's very similar to the meta. It's not going anywhere. So it's this so metaphysics has a history of a navigation away from forms of ever meta-ness. And that is a location of the lack. That's a locating of the lack. And if we locate that lack there, then you can also trust in it and experience it better and get better at cultivating your relation to it. But today, because it's almost like we don't even believe in a world, the world doesn't world for us anymore, then what ends up happening is you're skipping to the metaphysics before the topography, before the geometry per se, which then it's a question of what is metaphysics then? Because it really is hard to make sense of what it is if it's not a navigation of a territory. But it's like what can happen in modern thought is metaphysics is trying to be the reestablishment of the territory using just category. Well, that's not going to do it. It's got to be more like painting. See, basically for me, in order to do a new metaphysics, you have to start with phenomenology. Phenomenology, after you establish that, which is going to get you in the direction of topography and situation, then you can do metaphysics, because now you have a territory upon which to locate the lack and which to navigate between the ever meta. But there is a step, there is an ordering here that has to occur. And we have kind of lost sight, like I always talk about with Aristotle, the Aristotle change, like we really make a kind of mistake in separating Aristotle into a bunch of different books, because the reason I mean that is Aristotle is basically one long argument. Like, okay, if reality is always changing, then there's something constant metaphysics. And if there's something constant, then it's possible to have a polis. And if it's possible to have a polis, what's the art? It's the Aristotle chain. Like it's a long chain that follows based on what starts as phenomenology, really. Like, let's pay attention to things. Okay, all we experience is change, and yet things don't change in changing. That's weird if you really pay attention to it. What is that? It's no different. And I think I like what you said as speculative realism as plurigamia, because that gets into like Quentin after finitude and different things. Because basically what the triple O is saying is let's look at an object again. But that's what Aristotle did. Aristotle's like, we can't do metaphysics until we really, really look at what's in front of us. Okay, and then you can do metaphysics. Well, now the speculative realists are like, let's really, really look at what's going on. Then once we get the topography, the situation, we can then work to metaphysics as navigation and a locating of the lack and ourselves, because there is a way in which we are a lack and the subject not being reducible to our own experience of the subject, right? There's a kind of lack. But here's the issue.
Okay.
If you do not locate the lack, there will still be a lack. It's just going to be in service of the ever meta. You have to locate the lack to make sure it's a lack that is an opening of mystery. If you don't own the lack, which means you don't learn the territory to navigate it, to locate the lack in things as the apathetic, because it's basically where there's a lack, there's a choice on if it's meta or apathetic. And if it's apathetic, it could be mystery. We say, oh, it's lack because it's ever meta-ing away. Well, you can choose to then relate to it in a manner that makes it thus. And so you eternally regress. Or you can say, oh, there's a lack that's always disclosing something else and thus be treated as a mystery. And then that means consciousness. What did you learn? In the same way that the color red makes you learn that consciousness is a thing that can think redness. If you experience things as disclosing to you a mystery, then you just learn that consciousness is a thing that can experience mystery, and that it is of the kind of being that is able to access that mystery. Well, you just learned a lot about yourself. You just learned that you're participating in the very thing that you're experiencing, and now you have some sort of community with it. And I think that's when you get into the Maximus. I think that's when you get into an understanding of the participation. But it comes from that place of metaphysics as navigating and a locating of the apathetic. I think it's exactly right. We in a philosophy of glimpses, Jacques and Rivera, and I, there's this kind of idea, we call it the phenomenology of lack on Aristotle, but we're also trying to connect it a bit to the Lacan and the psychoanalysis, because the lack in Aristotle, that is the work of metaphysics, in psychoanalysis is the same work of the same matter in the matter of the subject. And there are ways to bring these things together to actually see how they create a whole situation, geometrical, an entire terrain that then discloses a mystery, thus saving us from the ever meta, because that's the work. If you don't locate the apathetic, then you are going to, it's basically a matter of time before you fall into the ever meta. That goes back to Hume. If you don't learn philosophical self-defense, it's only a matter of time before someone comes along with an idea of how you should live your life, or an idea of what would make you freer, or an idea of what is the good. And then you just go down that rabbit hole and you've been controlled. You've lost it all.
Exquisite. What I will say will not, in my opinion, add to what you're saying, because I do not know how to add yet to it. But I will offer what I think are concrescences of what you're saying to me that allow them relief in vividness, perhaps. First, a reference to Kierkegaard, because why not? In a simple example, and this is mine, one way of talking about the space in a space and seeing a simple proof of access to it, of its resources in us and its pathway through us, and its seasonability, is the presence of tears. Uncalled for tears. The time-boundedness of those tears. The predicates we add to those tears, such as cleansing, whatever we might say, from the inside, from the background of those tears. Simple proof of a world inside. Saints, St. Athanasius, I'm sure you can find this in other mystic traditions. They will give name to this place in a space, or this place in place. And they'll reference it, yes, metaphorically, but I think there is something they had in mind when they named it this way. They named it a garden. And with a garden comes the implicit acknowledgement of somebody's answering the call of husbandry. Someone tended the garden, protected it from riffraff. We both know how hard it is to keep a garden. Everything in nature seems to want to be in a state of nature, although it's a conspiracy. Their state of nature is to mess up, tear, bite, make homes in, loiter. Why couldn't they do it 5 steps over there? What I'm trying to separate from the world, they make the epicenter of the world. Garden, not the wilderness. Well, how do we keep the garden going? How do we cultivate? We now already fall into a possible meta or a possible mystery, because either this garden will reflect the values and mores of the outside larger world of my culture and society, and whoever the latest sophist is on how to keep a garden. Or it will reflect none of those things. It will be something fake, a miniature garden made of plastic cardboard to look good. In other words, it's not prosaic, but it's it's a polemic against the world. Okay, all these things. It wants to be window shopping for those in the world. If it's not doing any of those things, if it's not in an agon, as Harold Bloom might say, when he talks of representations, right? The good ones are in an agonistic relation to their worthies, their worthy rivals. If we're not going to go into that, which might blur the edge of psychoanalytics, then we could talk about a garden, perhaps the way the ancients did. It is a separate thing, although it holds to its laws with much more rigor than we are willing to hold to our relationships out here, which is a testament to its deeper reality, not to its contrivance. That's their argument. And one of the ways you water the garden of the interior, perhaps the only way, is through tears. You don't water it with cloud. So when you tear up, you could say, I'm not suffering from whatever's in the DSM. But this kind of tear, and it is a kind of tear, is a tear for my garden. You're speaking in metaphors and riddles. Yes, without the topography, I am speaking in riddles and nonsense and post-structuralism. I am.
Right.
Hence the need for the propedeutic.
Yes.
The time in the gym. Otherwise, you will miss tears that you are having. And what a bivalence to be missing the tears that I am having, that you are having. And so we ask ourselves, why are we given year after year after year after year? Kierkegaard comes into play. I said all that as preface to his work, Fear and Trembling, because I would argue it is a cautionary tale. Not about, oh, don't live the life of Abraham. It sucks. Look how incommensurate every step was. And so he had no rhetoric, even to speak to his beloved son. I don't think that's the cautionary tale. The cautionary tale is through the pseudonym, Di Silentio, who is not silent at all. Every word, every syllable of that treatise is from meta silence, who cannot but admire Abraham. And this is telling for me. Often he will say, when invoking Greek tragedy, the measure, the bar of the good stuff, the elite versus the riffraff, they are owed tears. Who could not shed a tear for Agamemnon? Who could not shed a tear? And he can't stop saying it. They are owed tears. He's an art appreciator, is he not? Who could not shed tears? Who could not shed tears? By Abraham, I am appalled. I cannot shed him tears, which makes me admire him even more. It's an upper stage meta. He's beyond tears. Well, I don't care that this Di Silentio in his silence has found so many metas and being appalled beyond shedding of tears, which shocks you like a thunderbolt coming right beside you. Lightning bolt, excuse me. But for Agamemnon, who's a couple stages down in abstraction, he is due tears. We ought to give to him those tears. He's not saying that as a philosopher, because remember, Di Silentio says in the prologue, I am not a philosopher. I'm not giving you the system. I'm giving you my art appreciation. He's saying this as a pseudonym, which is a meta on top of these other metas, which is Kierkegaard's true commentary, I would argue, about the danger of the meta pathway. Why am I saying this? To say time and again, they are owed tears, is to say it from a place of not having shed tears yourself. I will stay in the art museum until it is closing time. Then I know it's time for me to go. Tears don't come and go that way on schedule. And so the cautionary tale is not, don't end up like Abraham, you will lose everything. I would say the cautionary tale is, don't end up like the benign admirer. Because what does he have? Except a book called Fear and Trembling, with no fear and trembling at all. Forgive me, I feel that I'm on a soapbox, but I'm trying to, in a sincere way, get out of my own meta loops. And I know one way quickly to jumpstart that withdrawal is pathos. And I think that was Kierkegaard's underlying motivation in presenting this meta through Fear and Trembling. In fact, he said in his journal that he will be remembered for no other book than that, if only because of its pathos. Last thing, Wes Anderson films, I think, are studies in pathos, radiating through the meta. Notice Wes Anderson in almost all his films will have a miniature somewhere, a miniature set, micros. It's to give us this sense that we could interpret it in a number of ways. But I think Wes Anderson is a aesthetic child of Kierkegaard. Existentialism, I think, has to deal with these macro, miniature, meta, but the bleeding blood teardrop coming out of that through all that concrete, all that fake rust, is something basic, like a boy falling in love with a girl. In some way, you can't make that meta. And the proof is you can stack up metas on top of it, and you'll still have it radiating through. That's why Kierkegaard, through Fear and Trembling, used that basic story. And I'd ask myself for so long, why? Why does he use the choreography of a man and a woman, a suitor, and a beloved, and staying true to your love? Because you can stay true to your love like Don Quixote through all the miasma of meta proliferation and meta efficiencies that are proffered to us. But the danger is in admiring yourself along the way, or admiring others who are good at catching it and saying they are due teardrops, but not dropping the tears yourself. And I think that relates precisely to the dropping of the knees, which you located in Karl Barth. But pathos now, pathos in this movement from object to object into subject to object.
Missed tears we are having. That's wonderful. Very, very well put. First, I think this insight that you can be ever meta on the boy falling in love with a girl, but not really change the main premise is really important, because what meta does is not change the thing that's ever metaing. It's kind of wasting time or deconstructing itself, but it's not really changing. Mystery changes. Mystery changes. And that's one of the kind of phenomenological tests where you can tell if you're being ever meta or mystery. Like, is the subject change? Because a mystery unveils that the thing you thought was is not what you thought it was. There was more going on. Oh, you thought that was a tree? Nah, that thing's like a singing to the heavens. You thought that was a tree? Well, yeah, it's a tree. It's in it, but in its most treeness, it's way more than what you mean when you talk about a tree. And it brings to mind, C.S. Lewis, he put it so well with the Chronicles of Narnia. New Narnia is where blue's more like blue, people are more like people. It's not where you escape the world, but where the world is more like itself. When you experience mystery, you do feel that. And likewise, when you're in the ever meta, you lament that. You feel that sort of just lostness. And I think that's an example of a kind of phenomenological test, that when you're dealing with these things that are almost like reverse mirror images of one another, paying attention to that is so important. Well, what is that? That's pathos, right? I think what the point you're getting at on pathos is the kind of secret, like the test, the thing that comes out that kind of pins down is a sort of term. There's something very important about that. I think also your analysis of Kierkegaard was extraordinary. When I think about meta-modernity at its best, now the problem with this word is now meta-modern means integral theory, a speculative community, but in art theory, as Greg Dember will talk about, meta-modern, and I like Mr. Dember quite a bit, meta-modern is the oscillation primarily between postmodernism and modernism, and you move back and forth and back and forth. And he defined Wes Anderson as very meta-modern, as an example of that. And you see, the key also is, I think Kierkegaard did something quite similar with irony. Kierkegaard's like, if you show irony going back and forth, there's eventually a point where you feel like you're lost, and in that lostness, an emotion comes out that frees you. Likewise, in the going back and forth between post-modernity and modernity in these movies, there's a point where the going back and forth leads you to a tear, and I'm out of it. I'm out of the oscillation. And that, but precisely the coming out of it, the kind of breaking out of it, was due to the going into it. Likewise, Dante going through the Inferno and the Purgatorial to come to the Paradiso. For David Hume, it is not an option anymore to not be, let's put it this way, to not be meta. He says philosophical consciousness is spread around the world. You can't go back. Like, it's done. The door is slammed. So the problem of meta is a problem of everyone. And he says the moment you found a government on grounds of not, say, supplies and roads, but freedom, well, freedom is a philosophical construct. So now even the average person is philosophical. And for David Hume, that means the average person is at risk of this ever deconstruction that we are calling ever meta. So now everyone is Dante at the midlife. You can say history is a sort of midlife thing. And the she-wolf is there and we can't go back. And it's like, oh, crap. And it's like, well, we got to go through. And Kierkegaard comes along as Virgil. He's like, yep. Guess we're going to have to really pay attention to this movement of philosophy and irony. We're going to have to go in there. So let's go into the Inferno. There's no other way. Gotta, you want to see Beatrix? Well, I don't know how to tell you this, buddy. We got to go through the risk of the meta and not fall into it. Meta-modernity is showing that kind of movement. It's like you're in it, but actually you can walk across the devil's head and then come out and see the stars on the other side of it, right? But it's the pathos that does it. The pathos that results from the philosophical consciousness. Because if you really are philosophical enough, if you really think an idea to its deepest point, then you get into that radical isolation to the point where you are Abraham. And only you have your idea, and only you can understand your idea, and you alone are the philosopher king. And in this example, it's the eclipsing of the ethical with the theological, or the language that Kierkegaard uses. You're there and you're alone. Look at it. Look at it real close. The only way that you can get out of this situation is if something comes through. Suddenly, the goat, God, wait, tears. Something has to come through. Suddenly there's a way across the devil's head into the purgatory. And tears is a great, great symbol of this, because suddenly there's a design. Suddenly it's not just a movement. Suddenly there's a design. And it does make me think of a garden. How do you tell the difference? And that's the garden with the location of the space. The moment you have a tear, then there is a space. There is a space where something can break through and change the quality of everything. It does exist. This is, you're now on your knees. You've experienced the existence that's different in qualitativeness than the existence of the apple. You've now tasted it. And that's a result of going through. You now know what it's like to see the love that moves the sun and the other stars. You've had the movement and the oscillation lead you to a place where the wings fail the lofty fantasy, where you see something more. A garden, how do you tell the difference between a weed and a flower? If you say that's a weed and that's a flower, there's a design. There's a garden. There's a space. The moment you're able to tell the difference between, say, a qualitative experience of the ever meta and the pathos breaking through, well, then you've proven there is a space within a space of something more that can break through. And what Kierkegaard, I think, suggests to us is that if we actually pay good attention to irony and really see what irony does, then we should all basically kind of be doomed. And if we're not doomed, ain't that a miracle? Like, the tear is a kind of miracle. And so if we don't have spaces by which we can see a miracle, then we can't see the world designed according to miracles. And if it's not designed according to miracles, then it's not designed according to mysteries, because miracles are the works of mystery that point to the thing, that it can be beyond all of the constancy. And then something breaks through. In the same way that the pathos breaks through, the tears, the miracle breaks through, and then it goes back to normal. Then it goes back. But there was a break. I did capture that glimpse of eternity through the transience, that glimpse of the different qualitative take of things. I want more of that. I'm going to put myself in the place of that design. And I think it is really lovely to think of Kierkegaard as suggesting with the pseudonym this me to be in the Abraham, not just the admirer. Because, of course, there is this critique of the Christendom where we admire Abraham and we look at Abraham. But there's something that just keeps us in the meta-modern, that just keeps us in the going back and forth in the ever-meta. Admiration is not enough. There has to be participation. You have to participate in what Abraham is participating in. Admiring Dante going through Inferno and the Paradiso is not enough. You must participate in Dante going through the Inferno and the Paradiso. That is where there's the possibility in that participation of the oscillation, the back and forth, and then I'll give it to you. That's only there can the tear show up. Only there can it bring forth. And be a tear that is watering a garden as opposed to just something the eye does. For tears to even have that metaphoric resonance requires a design where metaphor is not mere decoration, but a certain language by which to understand the mystery. Metaphor without mystery is just a decoration. But if there is a mystery, suddenly you can go, wait a minute, maybe metaphor is the grammar of that mystery. And the tear in the meta suddenly becomes the water metaphoric of garden, thus pointing as a grammar to this very mystery. But that would require not just admiring Abraham, but participating in that, participating in the walking through Inferno, and then it would be possible to have those sort of tears. It will not do to simply admire someone whose wings have failed the lofty fantasy. We need our wings to fail the lofty fantasy, which sounds terrifying, but that's when you see the love that moves the sun and other stars.
This to me is the apologetic of Christianity. I would say that as a Christian. Not the apologetic, for there are perhaps many, but I would say it rehearses in my mind the apologetic of Kierkegaard. I thought you said it wonderfully. The ricochet and ping-ponging of ironies until, snap, I'm out of it through pathos, which Kierkegaard, at least in that book, took as a universal theme, a Hegelian sublimation that makes the pauper on par with the prince, because both can cry over their lost child, their present absence. Even if one had a child and lost the child, the other one had no child but wanted a child. They both feel this pathos, where if they were in a room, they could talk past the pomp and circumstance through the frothy language that was tended to by bars and meet one another in the middle of that passion, that suffering, that change which is ever present and so is not a change. But and then it brings into relief in the background the throne, the crown, the saloon, the plow, and we can ask ourselves, as if we were philosophers, which the king is not and the pauper is not, but as if they could, through passion alone, they could say, what is that throne all about? Why do you plow all day? And what do you think about when you plow all day? What do you think about when you sit in a chair all day? And this place they have come to is a passing over. I don't think Kierkegaard could have been Kierkegaard without Hegel, who he learned through another professor who was not Hegel. In other words, he was paraphrased too from another man, the Hegelian system, that then Kierkegaard received and fused with Socrates and his own branch of, I would say, historical drama, his exegesis of Abraham. So I want to ask you, after I make a statement, and the statement is, I think you and I have put our finger on not only the prolegomenon and the propedeutic, but the stakes of what is at issue.
Yes.
Moses said, choose today life or death. Choose this day. Well, how is that recapitulated today? I think you said it beautifully. Although in your beautiful saying of it, you made it palpable, which is terrifying. Choose this day, meta or mystery.
Yeah, right.
Neither one are single steps. But I am comfortable saying the meta is broad, and many find it.
Yeah.
Myself included.
Absolutely.
I don't know, to use this Freudian slip, how many metas I have left to confess, or I have yet to confess. I have yet to see in the color of an apple a gift. Because again, I ask, why are we given years? Why are we given the succession of days which follow the same pattern? Why are we re-experiencing these things? Are we supposed to see something new in that chair at Home Depot? I saw it there, now I brought it home. Here it is. 2 years later, there it is. Am I supposed to? Why is it here? Why is it here so long, ever changing? It's terrifying. Jonathan Edwards, instead of talking about how slick and thin the distance between myself and hell is, he could have talked about why was I given to study this chair like Monet with the hay bales? Really? Why? So we're asking why again. Why? And it's not in repose this time. It's in anxiety. It's in worrisomeness. Worry about the future, which is a subject. Now I'm in a Martin Buber I thou perhaps. Will Matthew always be talking about chairs, calendar year after calendar year? If I don't have festivals, Jonathan Peugeot now, if I don't have festivals, fractal patterns that are distributed throughout my community, then yes, I might be stuck in the cave known as my subject-object relation to said chair from Home Depot. But one can become too studious of their calendar year and go the way of the West. What I mean by that is, I am quite concerned about the number of angels dancing on the head of a pin. I want to know the number. I want to know how they can be individuated. And I don't have a sense of commitment to knowing the answer, but we should, through our scholasticism, find out. I think Kierkegaard could stereotype that as a room full of people saying, this question is due an answer by somebody. That Greek tragedy is due tears from someone. And we can say that about the environment. This climate change problem is due a response from someone. And we can just live out our lives saying, well, yes, that's reliably due a response from someone. And so we're becoming not only receivers of meta, but we're becoming conduits of meta, which is making us, I think, something other than human. Maybe that's where the transhumanism discussion could find an organic graphing in here. Because I don't see it as that interesting a topic, to be quite honest with you, transhumanism. But I do find it to be a byproduct of not putting phenomenology before metaphysic. And I agree with you. I think you're emphasizing that antecedent is correct, fundamentally. And now I would ask you, do you think historical drama will make a comeback in the way that science fiction was? Because one way you could pose the problem of historical drama is the meta and the mystery, life and death.
I really like the idea of bringing in the ever meta is wide and the mystery is narrow. That's lovely, and I like the idea of confessing the meta. I think that's exactly right. We have to choose this day, mystery or meta. And again, David Hume would say you can't not choose. You're always already in the philosophical consciousness. So choose. I think also what you said on Kierkegaard and Hegel is very good. The either or, you're married or you're not, you'll be miserable. Like the either or is the movement of the dialectic. And what the either or shows is you can never escape the dialectic. And for Hegel, who is big on historical drama, the pathos is the break. And it's the same in Kierkegaard. They both have lots of similar thinking that's overlapping in different ways. And if you look at life, it's an either or. Either you get this career or that career. Either way, can't pay your mortgage. Either way, you're not living where you want to be. You know, how do you break out of the either or? you have to be, though, in the condition of making choices that you find out neither works precisely to then have the experience that leads to the emotion in which the pathos breaks through. So you have to have the either or, because that is the condition of the revelation that suggests the speculative knowing. The dialectic leads into the speculative, the either or in Kierkegaard leads to the faith. It leads to the leap, it leads to the courage. And I think that being the case, like you're saying on this question, you know, how do I respond? Is this dual response? It makes me think earlier too, and I'll also say that the I-it is the ever meta, the I-thou is the mystery. So whatever is a bit has an ever meta, and I think that's true. It's almost like things are dual response. I think we need to think of things are dual location, just like you were saying earlier.
Right there with you.
Global warming is due a location in our lives. It's due some sort of fitting in the scenery, in the garden. It is due a location in the garden. Likewise, and when you think in terms of location, I think it's more topography, it's more terrain, it's more phenomenology, because a response, you can respond and it's not part of the terrain. It's not located in anything. I responded and then it kind of goes off, right? Like, we need to think about things as deserving a location. Not a response. And likewise, when you look at the chair, you say, is this due a response? Well, it's due a location. Is it something I should think about all the time? Is it something I should let be invisible? Is it something that today, in the topography of my day, this particular day, it deserves a location of being this thing that reminds me how strange it is that this chair is the chair that stood out to me. And now the chair has a location. It has a location of you sitting on it or being near it. It's there. Are you responding to it? This is the funny thing. Location includes response, but response doesn't necessarily include location. And so the issue is that we've made a real emphasis on algebraic response and not had geometrical location. And so then we're like, oh, are these things due responses? Well, the question is, they're due locations. How do you locate them in your life? And that would be the locating of the apathetic, the locating. And that also is the gymnasium. Here's the problem. We're trying to train thought according to a gymnasium of response. What we need is to put thought through a gymnasium of location, learning the art of locating, learning the art of being located and locating things. All training of thought has done it according to responses and answers, not topography, not phenomenology, not terrains. We need to look at the things in our life and ask, what is it due a location? And to try to locate it, because that is a different skill set, I think.
I will have to go in 15 to 20 minutes.
Yes.
This has been lovely. Thank you for your time.
It has been lovely.
I want to ask you this, though, as a follow-up question. The present absence. Take Peterson's room. You wake up and your eyes open, and now you have a field of possibility. You don't have a bedroom. I know he's tongue-in-cheek when he says that, and someone could write it away as quantum mechanical wishy-washy stuff. But I think he is one of our premier Montaignes. Jordan Peterson.
Sure. Yeah.
How he tells compact stories. They're there in the same way that Montaigne quoted Cicero. His waking up, opening your eyes to a field of possibility, not a bedroom, for example. Peterson's there, I think, for us to take his examples out and then play with them, as he encourages us to do in a accommodating manner. With that said, we come to a place. I walk in my room. I'm standing at the proverbial bus stop, and I feel a lack. It's inchoate. Why am I feeling this way? Is it the genetic predisposition to name some grotesque illness? Is something broken? Whatever. That is a response to a present absence. I don't know yet what it is, in the sense that there has been no phenomenon yet that I can see. But there is a phenomenon, some sense, some call it angst, dread, this foreboding, this third person point of view, I would rather say, has been given to me in a glimpse. There we go. I'm living first person, and then seemingly out of nowhere, a third person point of view is given to me in a glimpse. And then what? That juncture, that place of transition is what I'm asking you about.
Yep.
God forbid we have algorithms that tell us what to do in those transitions. Though algorithms may come in the form of sophists or sophists in the form of algorithms to pretend to. But why am I already prejudiced against such algorithmic response to this place? I do not know. It might be temperamental. But how does one, and I will ask, not putting the cart before the horse, but the horse first of phenomenology, how does one begin to reduce to the idea, to the look, to the appearance of the phenomenon, to the phenomenon of this third person glimpse? How does one address the coming? You don't have to have the right answer, but how do you stretch with that one? It sounds perhaps horribly either pedantic or as if I'm talking from someone else's mouth, but I don't think I am. I'm asking you genuinely, how would you begin to make sense?
Excellent. First off, I greatly to have a headache and to speak so well is magnificent. Thank you. And also
you and I
thank
both, though. I've learned so much from you tonight. I value this.
I value this as well. And I appreciate it, Matthew. I think the first thing on this question that I actually think is actually if philosophy is to be a gymnasium for the metamodern age, if we grant that term, which means many things, but for 2023, it does seem that it would have to focus on this. The phenomenology of lack, you could say. The phenomenology of the present absence. What do you experience? The reason why I think actually focusing on this is so important is because it unveils that you are simultaneously of experiencing things, experiencing a horizon with the things. You're experiencing something of which everything is in, not merely things. Because you can suddenly experience everything as a lack. You can suddenly experience this thing that's here but not here. Well, that means your experience is not limited to empiricism. It's not limited to what you observe. It also means observation and experience are not the same thing. Because you literally are experiencing something you are not observing. Well, once you say, well, yes, you have hearing and touch, and we actually forget that all the time, the tyranny of sight, right? Like we literally forget all the time that experience is not merely observation. But here's the thing. Lack is not tasted. Lack is not heard. It's felt, but it's not felt like a notepad. So it's some sort of transsensual almost. I hate to use new terms, but it really is like you sense it, but you don't. You don't sense it, but you do. You feel it. Well, what do you mean feel it? I feel a pen. It's like, no, it's some sort of it's like we talk about the five senses, but it's quite clear that there's, in the same way that you have trans rationality now that Mr. Viveki will talk, there's some sort of trans sense. Like the trans senses that are going on. And the trans senses are the sensing of the horizon, to use like a Gadamer sense, right? In Truth and Method, he talks about the reason why art, and actually I think this speaks to the historic drama question. Like if you want to learn about the past, you need to study art because then you learn the horizon people lived according to, not just the information. Shelby Foote, Walker Percy, Hayden White, all of those historians were also quite big that the only way to do history is through literature, because otherwise you're gaining information, but not the way they phenomenologically experience the world. And if you don't get that, you don't learn history. You don't learn history unless you feel history. And the only way to do that is through something like literature. So for Hayden White, the key to good history was it becoming more like a historical drama. In fact, he basically argues that the only way to learn history is through the form of a historical drama, because otherwise you're not learning the horizon of history, you are learning the information of history. And that's very difficult to be changed by. And basically the argument is that if we don't learn to feel history, then we repeat history. It's not merely about learning history, it's about feeling history. Likewise, for life to be changed, it's about feeling a horizon. And the horizon is a present absence. It is the quality according to which all the things in your experience are there in a certain sense, trans sense. How is that possible? Where is that located? How do you do that? How do you read? Again, the beginning, you could say, if honestly, if you would ask me, what was the beginning of philosophy for me? It was that moment in that bathtub, reading Redwall, when I went, there is a movie in my head. Where am I? I see a movie when I'm reading a book. It's a horizon. It's like, it's worlding. Where am I? Likewise, when you experience a present absence, where are you? You don't observe it, but you experience it. If there is a difference between observation and experience, might it be the case, then, that there are things to experience that are not reducible to observation or sense in general? Might it be the case that there are things to experience that are transsensual, because they are more sensual than those things? They are precisely the horizon by which all things that you can sense are given their affordance. Pay attention to that. Get good at that. Think about that. Channel that present absent, because here's the thing. We have said earlier that you must choose this day between the ever meta or mystery. The moment you feel a lack, you're actually given a choice. Are you going to direct this toward the ever meta, ergo this bad nihilism of ever going and deconstructing? Or are you going to say, I feel a lack. Oh, this is what Aristotle was talking about. Oh, this is kind of the stuff that John of the Cross, Dark Knight, oh, there's some lack here. Maybe that goes toward mystery. So you choose. The key is that when you experience, I am of the opinion that the experience of lack or the ever horizon, I was speaking with Layman Pascal about this, it does seem to be something that shows up eventually. Like in everyone's life, it shows up. Some call it a midlife crisis. Some people call it, 18, 9. There's these moments where you have this, oh, everything has a quality beyond its observation. Oh, I have to experience something beyond the observable. Oh, I have to experience a present absence. I think the gymnasium is to get people ready to know that's going to occur, and then when it occurs, direct it toward the mystery instead of the ever meta, because right now we have a world that doesn't train people to be ready for that experience, so they're directing it toward the ever meta. And that's the call. We need now places that say, hey, this is coming. I told you it was. You've experienced transsensual. You've experienced experience that's not reducible to observation. Hey, you better direct it toward mystery, because otherwise you're going to the ever meta. And that's what's happened. We've left people unprepared, really. We've not given them a gem.
Thank you. What is the name of the man who spoke of knowing history through historical drama?
Well, Hayden White. Also, Selby Foote is quite good on this. And Shelby Foote also, based on Keats, said something that actually I think is relevant now that I'm talking. He said, a fact is not a truth until you love it. A fact is not a truth until you love it. And the idea is that we can't make history a truth until we have a pathotic relationship to it. And that's only possible through literature. We can't love history and turn it into a truth that then becomes a horizon according to which we operate unless we have some of emotional relationship to it. And this is where Shelby Foote does his Shelby Foote. He's the Civil War historian. He wrote these 3 giant volumes that are quite extraordinary in their literary quality, but from a methodology, what he's putting forth is that history is only learned, and I think of it like Benji in The Sound and the Fury. You are crawling under the fence, your outfit gets on snagged on the barb, and now you're back with Caddy, just like that. You're reading the Redwall, and now you're watching a movie, just like that. You're suddenly, and boom, there's a lack. You're in a experience that's not reducible to observation, just like that. And what Shelby Foote and I think Hayden White, they're all suggesting is the simulation, a replica, to go back to the beginning, of what you experience when you experience phenomenologically the present absence of lack, must somehow be achieved in history so that the horizon of history is encountered because we're just in it and therefore will be changed by it. that is the power of art. And it does seem as if art and literature in particular of history, but maybe in general, this seems to be what the gymnasium that trains us to be prepared for the present absence, why it will require something with the arts. Because the arts is the here but not here, the there with the T in parentheses. That then, like what Shelby Foote is saying, you must do in the reading of history if it is to actually change you or change the world or actually become something you occupy, like Benji is always and all time at the same time in The Sound and the Fury. And I think basically, if we have the right training, when we encounter the lack, and then we know not to just ask, how will I respond to it? But we're asked, how will I locate this? And you know to ask that question, because you said it very well. Metaphysics today is about locating the apathetic, locating the lack. All right, I'm experienced. Where will I locate it? Will I locate it on the road to mystery, or will I locate it on the road to the ever meta? And if you don't choose mystery, well, the world will choose the ever meta for you. So that's where you'll go. So I think for me, when I experience lack, or it pops up, or this sort of this weird experience of the horizon that is not reducible to the observation, it's a reminder of the choice I have to make, and a reaffirmation of that choice, and a reliving of that choice. Because when it says choose this day life, well, then choose everyday life. You have to choose it every single day. And I think encountering that is an opportunity to re-choose the lack, the apathetic, as a location on the way to mystery, as opposed toward the ever meta. So it's an invitation of reminding one of that choice that needs to be made. It needs to be made every single day.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. You have a good night. I'm going to sit with those thoughts.
I will do the same, Mr. Allison. I've enjoyed it, Matthew. Thank you for your time. I've enjoyed it a lot. Thank you. It's been wonderful.
Till next time, have a good night.
Blessings to you, Matthew.